So David is also from New Zealand. This is quite amazing. And two different committees chose the two different lecturers today. David's life and career alternated between New Zealand and Australia, where he was born in New Zealand and went to school there, and Australia, where he lives now. In 1991, after completing his PhD on shallow lakes in New Zealand, he moved to the Centre for Water Research at the University of Western Australia, where he was initiated into water quality modeling by joining the group of Professor Jörg Imberger. There he developed water quality modules for 1- and 3-dimensional hydrodynamic models. He then returned to New Zealand to take up the inaugural Bay of Plenty Regional Council chair in lake restoration at the University of Waikato from 2002 to 2017. With Chris McBride, he initiated a program of high-frequency monitoring combined with water quality modeling to support the lake management program for the Bay of Plenty. The high-frequency monitoring is now an integral part of the Regional Council's monitoring program. Part of the impetus for this work was through GLEON, the Global Lake Ecological Observatory Network, which most of you probably heard of. And David was one of the 4 people that initiated this entire group and its activities. In 2017, David returned to Australia as a professor at the Australian Rivers Institute at Griffith University in Brisbane. Today, he is the acting director of this institute, with some 75 PhD students in the institute and 160 members in total. David's research interests include water lake quality modeling, cyanobacteria harmful blooms, and real-time water quality sensors. He has published more than 270 scientific papers on these topics. Here in SIL, we should know that David is also the editor-in-chief of our journal, Inland Waters. He's been a SIL member since 1987, and he values the collegiality, the mentorship, and the friendships that the society has provided him over the years. And from my own personal angle, David is also a great friend, the kind you would like to have. He tells me that among his proudest achievements are the PhDs whom he advised, many of whom now play important roles in freshwater research and management in New Zealand and across the world. So, David, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Tamar. I can think of no greater honour than to be introduced by Tamar Zahari, whose work for SIL over the years is exemplary, who's a very tenacious person, who's a great friend and a great colleague. And I'd also like to acknowledge Eduardo BALDI as part of the BALDI Memorial Lecture. I'm charged under his guidance, I guess, by telling you a little bit about theoretical limnology, and you'll see a little bit of theory and a little bit of practice, I hope, in what's to come. The other aspect in keeping with 100 years of SIL is that I'll tell you a little bit about the past, the present, and I'll also allude to the future. I'll just acknowledge too my colleagues Simon Linke and Felipe Suarez Castro, and those two colleagues are part of an Australian Research Council grant that we have and have provided some of the work that's behind what I present today. So I'll start with an outline, and that outline is really just visually looking at some of the people. I'll tell you a little bit about the people that have influenced me just to start with. I'll do a quick chronicle of water modelling for you, looking at some of the very complex numerical models that we might use. And I'll also bring the data to life in terms of some of the geospatial opportunities that we have to be able to use that data and present it back to people. So I went around a number of colleagues here and asked them, have you got a photo of my PhD advisor? And none of them could oblige, and I couldn't either. So I thought, well, actually, this captures a lot about what my PhD advisor was about. His name's Stuart Mitchell, and I thought quite a lot about what this photo actually encompasses. It's a little lagoon. It's in the very bottom part of New Zealand. And when you think about shallow lakes, why would you want to really work on shallow lakes? And I thought a little bit more about that, and you can see some of it expressed here. There are capillary waves on the surface of the lake. When the wind gets up later in the afternoon, there'll be surface waves. Those surface gravity waves create currents. The currents then resuspend sediment. The pool waters and the resuspended sediment influence the macrophytes that are in this lake, the submerged macrophytes. The littoral and the pelagic are intimately connected. You've basically got a mesocosm here. And you can go right back to Forbes, 1887, and think about that mesocosm. Everything is there. Go to your local shallow lake, have a look at the birds, the animals that are on it, the animals that are in it, the pelagic, the littoral, and the riparian areas, and the catchment. It's a unique study system. And I'll come back a little bit further to that later on. But I do want to acknowledge a couple of things that Stuart drove me towards. One of them was you need to talk to the people. I never did during my PhD. You need to use the technology that might be coming up. And he was already thinking about remote sensing, and he was thinking about sensors that you might install into the water column to be able to give you a lot more information. Unfortunately, it took me a long time to realise that he was right. Some of the other people I just want to acknowledge quickly, and already Susie has talked about Carolyn Burns. So Professor Carolyn Burns, or Dame Professor Carolyn Burns, was an amazing lady. She was the Tienemann Naumann Award winner, and in 2007. And I'll tell you a story about her, actually, and it just illustrates how dedicated she was. I have a colleague, and he was wandering around the halls of the zoology department at 5 p.m, knowing that at 9 a.m. on the Monday morning he had to hand in his master's thesis. Carolyn saw his distress and asked him what was wrong, printed out his thesis. In those days there weren't too many other ways of doing it, certainly not email, and returned the hard copy to him the next morning so that he could have someone, because his supervisor was away on sabbatical, he could have someone that actually looked at his thesis. She was incredibly dedicated and has been incredibly dedicated, and now has established a chair at her university. And that chair is a substantial amount of money that Carolyn has given to the university to establish a chair. So I'm already advertising the chair. I'm sure there'll be some people that may be interested in that position. I'll mention a couple of others. Anne Chapman, who worked a lot with aquatic insects, and Anne had a hand in my very first conference, 1987, and that hand was actually in organising the field trips. And Anne does not know how lucky we were that day when we pulled a very prominent limnologist into our raft as he was drowning. I never told Anne about that, but we were very lucky that we came up and didn't have one short from our field trips back in the day. The other person is Vida Stout, and Vida Stout herself has created her own scholarship at the university where she was. And another person, Hilary Jolly, who preceded both Anne and Vida. And Hilary Jolly spent 2 years basically in a Morris Minor driving around New Zealand with a boat behind her, getting out at lakes and doing hundreds of Winkler titrations. She also left a legacy both in New Zealand and Australia, and one of those is the Hilary Jolly Medal in Australia. Another one is one that my students actually benefited from, which are scholarships that she set up to be able to continue to foster limnology. Now, the library came to me about 10 years ago or so and said, we're throwing out old theses, but we think we might have found one that you might be interested in, but we're going to probably throw it out. And I opened up the appendix of Hilary Jolly's thesis and found an amazing repository of Winkler's, or of the dissolved oxygen, the temperature profiles, the chlorophyll A, of about 50 New Zealand lakes. And they almost all had oxic hyperlimnia. And that is an amazing landmark for me, because when I came back many years after Hilary, of course, and was actually sampling many of those lakes, many of them had anoxic hyperlimnia, as, of course, Susie has described, was one of the, through other symptoms in her talk before me. And I couldn't go past being at the Centre for Water Research, the University of Western Australia. And in many ways, much of the work that I've heard while I've been here has actually been built on a legacy of much of Jorg's work. And that was that he dealt with physical limnology. He was really one of the pioneers, I guess, of physical limnology, and he developed up models of the hydrodynamics and supported by a great team. And he was also a pioneer of much of the technology that enabled him to be able essentially to take physical limnology into a really technical area at the time. And finally, I was convinced that I should get out and explore some more of this technology. All right, let me get into the main part of what I was going to talk about today. And I went and visited a PhD student's paper, or a PhD who's now finished, but he put together this nice little summary of sort of the progression of improved system understanding and looking at different areas such as the lake system, a summary of what that lake system was about, and some of the key references that relate to that. And you can see the progression from sort of very simplistic understanding, obviously, to more and more complex, including aspects of consumers, aspects of nutrient recycling, and microbial dynamics as well. And I'm just going to break those down as I go forward. Well, Forbes, 1887, I should say, even preceding 100 years of SAL, thought of the lake as a mesocosm. That the lake basically didn't have a catchment. And I want to just put up what Forbes said there in 1887. The animals of such a body of water are, as a whole, remarkably isolated, closely related among themselves in all their interests, but so far independent of the land about them that if every terrestrial animal were suddenly annihilated, it would doubtless be long before the general multitude of the inhabitants of the lake would feel the effects of this event in any important way. And I can immediately feel my editorial hat coming on and saying, I'm going to wipe out a few words here. But very interesting, isn't it? Just to read it and a little bit of amusement too at the same time. Then we came to a sort of seminal piece of work, if you like. Richard Vollenweider and others started developing up and thinking mathematically about lakes. And they thought of them basically as a black box in some ways, and they were completely mixed. But what came about here was that they were suddenly thinking about the catchment, the loading from the catchment. And that grainy equation is from Vollenweider in 1976, and it describes so much about a very simple mathematical representation of a lake, that the mass of total phosphorus in the lake at some time infinity or equilibrium time is dependent on the loading from the catchment, and as well as the flushing rate, QS, the mean depth, and another value, a sigma m there, which represents a sedimentation loss. And if you think about a sedimentation loss, you can put a simple value in here like 10 metres per year for total phosphorus to think about how you could use this equation to say, I've got a certain loading from the catchment, here's my mass in the lake. And then, of course, the limnological community at the time went mad with developing up or using these models to then predict chlorophyll. And people started using these theoretical equations, combining them with empirical work, and looking at what was the relationship between phosphorus loading and chlorophyll in a lake. And you can go to Jones and Bachman and many others, Sakamoto, to have a look at that work. It's the foundation of a lot of subsequent work. And then, I mentioned Imberger earlier, but here was developing up the models of now taking that black box and expanding out the black box into, in this case, the hydrodynamics. And a simple hydrodynamic model, which would look at the heat flux, the net heat flux, for example, due to solar radiation, due to temperature, due to vapor pressure, would look at the wind, would keep the catchment being relevant because you have inflows to a lake, of course, and of course the clarity of that lake that influenced the stratification dynamics as well. The next one was, what about if we could take some of these models and make them even perhaps more spatially resolved, maybe three-dimensional? And maybe we can start looking at catchments and actually expand out the catchment or even have a catchment model. And so the major drive now is to be able to couple catchment models with lake models that are highly spatially resolved and better represent the dynamics of the internal dynamics of a lake. And I've got to say, the last part is the big challenge. The internal dynamics of the lake, we do fairly well with some of the hydrodynamics, but it's a massive challenge to be able to think about how we best represent, for example, the food chain, the microbial processing, and how we are able to put basically algorithms on that to be able to have full water quality models. Some of the innovations, for example, have been to use individual-based modelling. Individual-based modelling, in this particular case, for example, it might be cyanobacteria. And the difficulty with the hydrodynamic models that I've described is that they essentially throw everything into a box. So every time step, essentially the memory of the phytoplankton, whether they've been exposed to light or nutrients, is basically homogenised at every time step. So an individual-based modelling approach is one way to get around that because you're tracking the particles. So there may be colonies of cyanobacteria. They could be zooplankton. The individual-based modelling is a way of being able to track that and give them memory and not lose that memory with the Eulerian-type framework that's used in many of these models. Now, here's a Eulerian framework which was looking at simulations of cyanobacteria in a Paraguayan lake. And I want you to think for a moment about going out and taking your 200 mils of sample for chlorophyll in this lake. It's a beautiful simulation of the hydrodynamics, but it still suffers the same fate that it doesn't keep a memory of these particles or the cyanobacteria. So physically, where they're being shifted around, it's great. There are more dynamics that could usefully be incorporated into a model like this. So the alternative, in this case a local lake where I am, around Brisbane, would be to do the individual-based modelling. Now the time frame has been sped up a lot here, of course, but what you can see with the different colours is essentially surface cyanobacteria being red and some of the other colours being deeper in the water column. And what I love about this one is that you can see these very calm phases. And then all of a sudden, when the wind blows, all of that's thrown all over the place. And you see the individual colonies of cyanobacteria moving around the lake. These lakes are highly dynamic, and so our previous understanding of the lakes at equilibrium, or going back even to Forbes and saying it's not even connected to the catchment, we need to be able to capture, of course, these types of dynamics. Can we scale it? Can we take it up to lakes around the globe? Well, this was a huge effort a few years ago now. 42 lakes. I can see people nodding around the room, some of them whom were involved in various aspects of this project. And it was really, really challenging. We went for very detailed forcing data to drive the models, and were able to say, well, maybe we can categorise these lakes by their lake type so that we may be able to progress to multiple lakes, maybe 10, maybe 100, maybe 1,000. Maybe, well, besides the very large ones, maybe thousands and thousands. How do we do that? How do we move from working on our individual systems where we get more and more knowledge, and we have extensive knowledge of lakes as individuals, but if we really are to make an impact to the politicians, to the managers, we're going to have to somehow scale this issue. So process modelling is amenable to description of the state, but less so for the prioritisation of actions as we move to local or regional scale. How do you choose which lake you're going to restore? Where are you going to put your money? How many lakes are you going to try and restore? Are you going to do 3,800 lakes in New Zealand and look at that 70% that are eutrophic and put all your money there and send the country bankrupt? There has to be a prioritisation here. So it's an enormous challenge. And to be critical, I don't think we're quite meeting that challenge yet. The UN, whether you take the UN Decade of Restoration or you take the Water Action Decade, we're not quite stepping up to that challenge yet. Buried in there is water quality, 6.3.2. We're not able, and we haven't been able, to get the same level of interest as, for example, the IPCC has done. And I'm starting to ask freshwater alliances, an international panel, an intergovernmental panel for dealing with our freshwater crisis. We need something, and we need it very quickly. How do we prioritise which lakes receive the attention? I mentioned tens of thousands of lakes across the globe that are requiring our attention. I'll just go back there, sorry. And for me, I worked on a set of lakes in the Rotorua region of New Zealand, and there are about 15 or so lakes in that region, and we had to think about which of these lakes are we going to make an investment in. And eventually, when that does play, there was something in behind there, but it's not going to do it. Well, one way might be to accept that some of the forcing data in these models is imperfect. But what we can do is use things like the Virtual Climate Network to be able to drive some of the data. So can we scale? Well, maybe we can using these types of data sets that are available. So we get out of our domain and we go and we talk with the climatologists or the meteorologists to be able to effectively utilise these data. Maybe we can scale to 10, maybe 100, maybe 10,000. Winslow and others were able to do that for the hydrodynamics of lakes in the USA. And we've got very quickly some rapid agglomeration of data sets. And here, for example, is HydroAtlas. HydroAtlas takes hydrosheds, hydrobasins, hydro rivers, and uses these geospatial data across many, many variables and 1 million subcatchments, 8 million river segments. And we've got Lake Atlas. Sorry, I'm just trying to adjust this. Lake Atlas has 1.4 million lakes and reservoirs now. But I want you also to look at the time frame of the publications. These publications are the last 3 or 4 years. This field is evolving incredibly quickly about time-stamped and geospatial data, very, very quickly. You can look at evapotranspiration, irrigated area, wet season inundation, lithographic classes, cropland fractional cover across the globe. So it's really to emphasise the point that the agglomeration of databases now allows us to very effectively be able to look at large local, regional and global areas. Some of the additional lake attributes, some of these have been published in the last, well, actually very recently. Area, perimeter, depth, volume, residence time, buffer area associated with different lakes around the world, and also the bathymetry of lakes across the globe. And part of the idea here is we can now combine these multiple sources of data. We've got our physiographic variables, hydrological variables, socioeconomic variables, and that might help us to ask the question, where and how much do we have to invest to restore some of these lakes? And now we start to step into the field of spatial conservation planning. So it's really an agglomeration of 3 main areas: conservation planning, land use planning, and natural resource management. And using algorithms associated with these different geospatial areas, what we can do is develop up things like weighted human influence on catchments. We're able to do things geospatially that we were never able to be able to do. Producing accessible and unbiased visualizations from complicated, uncertain data requires expertise and knowledge from science, policy, computing, and design. We are asked to be both a detailed scientist, but also to be highly interdisciplinary from using the expertise of others in our field that are probably sitting at conferences all around the world at the moment, talking about how they advance their field. And when you think about some of those advances, just think about that chlorophyll sample that you took, that 200 mils of chlorophyll sample in a lake. Whereabouts did you take it? And are you effectively using all of the resources that are available to you to be able to interpret it? Here's an example of using satellite data to be able to get temperature on the water surface, to dive down beneath the lake, to look at the bathymetry at 1 metre resolution, and then to be able to look at the data set that is from a buoy, and in this case it's temperature, and from a biofish that goes up and down moving across the lake to be able to collect data. And it collects data on chlorophyll, dissolved oxygen, phycocyanin, and temperature. But how do we bring these types of data sets to life? And we have to be careful as scientists. Cartohypnosis. The audience exhibits a high degree of suggestibility in respect to stimuli aroused by the map and its explanatory text. As scientists, we need to be able to guide, but we have the tools to be able to visualize the data sets. So what we might have is static data. We have technology and we have data, and we're trying to harmonize those data across different technological platforms now to complement the chlorophyll and the cell counts and the details of the microbial populations that we might sample from just a few droplets of water in a lake. And it's there. The sensors are there to complement it. The satellites are there, and the ability to cover large spaces or large spatial scales is there from a boat. So now I want to tell you fairly quickly about a project that we've had going, and it's really about how do we bring the data to life. It's called Building Catchment Resilience, and it's a collaboration amongst 2 universities. And what we're essentially doing is we're taking the geospatial data that I described. You know, it can be LiDAR data, it can be soils, it can be vegetation type, land cover, land use, etc. Put that essentially into the washing machine. We've ripped out a whole lot of algorithms out of our water quality models, and that enables us to be able to process that data and generate a series of scenarios of what if. Now, these are not ordinary scenarios that you get from numerical models where we go and we say, oh, we'll halve the nutrient load. These are optimized scenarios. And then we'll look at visualization tools. What tools are available so that we can actually interpret the data and we can present it to stakeholders or managers or government, perhaps. Now, here's the boring part. This is the part that is essentially a static image. Put this up in front of the public or in front of the political masters, and they'll go, well, interesting. But it's actually, what I'm showing are 3 possible solutions here. So what this tool does is it's an optimization of the numerical modelling that we are actually doing. And what it's optimizing for is what the stakeholder might want. So some stakeholders might say, I really want to get the sediment, or I really want to get the nitrogen, or I want the lowest cost option that you can possibly get. And so what we have here is a Pareto front of optimized or possible solutions that would help to address that. And so the red colour there is obviously optimizing for essentially the lowest sediment production, the lowest particulate nitrogen. The blue in the middle might be some sort of middle band type case, and then the green being essentially another case with the lowest cost. So I told you that putting that up in front of the audience is pretty difficult. How are they going to interpret it? I know that you can, but it's a little bit more difficult for some of the political people, some of the managers, to be really able to interpret that. And so what we did was we looked at how can we use some of the virtual reality, for example, to be able to help us with this issue. And working with another group, we decided to try and take that output and be able to make it, yes, truly visual. So you can put on a set of goggles and you can fly the catchment as shown in the left-hand side. You can choose your scenarios that you might want, and you can pick whereabouts for those different scenarios you might want to do the restoration. And you can also walk the catchment. And here we're choosing a scenario. In this case, it's gully restoration, putting the trees on it and being able to walk that catchment and see what the restoration would actually look like. And so this is not just virtual reality, this is actually underpinned by really solid data. And these scenarios have been optimized for what people might want. And then we can zoom back out and we can take a look at planning units or spatial elements within a catchment to be able to see what the catchment overall would look like under these different restoration scenarios. Now we sort of almost automatically combine elements of ecological, economic and social when we start to do this. But if you think about, in the Wortley et al. Paper, 94% of the ecosystem studies deal purely with ecology. 0.5% deal with the economics of restoration, 0.5% deal with the social elements of restoration, and 1% hits the sweet spot in the middle there, which might be relevant to all three. It's a key point. We have to be able to extend out and think about how we go beyond our ecological studies and be able to bring inference about what it really means socially and economically. So, people are a big part of the solution, of course. The clock is ticking. The UN SDGs should have water first and foremost, in my opinion. And it's not just that climate drives water, water drives climate as well. How do we balance, and it's still a question for you, how do we balance the models? Some are very complex, some are very simple. We have to use them in unison and be able to extend out the range of local, regional, even to global scale to be able to alert to what's going on in our freshwater systems. The time is ticking. This was what I encountered in February this year. I was isolated with a group for 5 days. These floods were unprecedented. We have just had what they call 1 in 1,000 year floods, except they're not 1 in 1,000 years anymore. This was the place that I called up the evening that I realised I was trapped and said, "Do you have any rooms available?" Well, it was a case of rooms with a view in this case. What's the pathway to our future? So I'm challenging the group across here, the intellectual minds that we have, to be able to coordinate the Freshwater Alliance, or whatever we call it. We have to alert now to the changes that are occurring. We can't just describe, as Rob Peters would say. We have to be able to predict, and we have to be able to tell our political masters, you need to make change pretty quickly. I just want to end by thanking some colleagues. Chris McBride is a master of the data harmonisation and has been a leader in some of the Lake Buoy work. Susie Wood and Michelle Burford are great colleagues. I love the complementarity that we work in because they do the field and experimental and I do the modelling and sometimes the field, and so it's been a really nice combination. And also to Simon Linke and Felipe Suarez Castro, who have really helped me out with some of the spatial planning work that I presented just now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, for another inspiring speech, talk. And I'm opening the floor for questions. Yes, please. Ingrid. Here.
Thank you, David. I was wondering what the more tightly phrased targets would be for the Freshwater Alliance that you're proposing, because I was thinking that issues like sufficient nutrient removal from wastewater treatment would be more local, whereas the agricultural problems are hugely global, and the political issues we need to address is shipping food all across the world because producing it in some countries is cheaper than in others. So we're very quickly in this economic area of agricultural politics. Would that be what a Freshwater Alliance, an international one, would mostly need to address? Or what is it more precisely that you're thinking of?
Well, what we've seen, I guess, is a transition from, we know how to deal with point source pollution, but still in the developing world, it's still a huge problem. It needs better investment, but for others, and for the developing world, it's it's about diffuse pollution. And in the developing world, a lot of that diffuse pollution is actually being caused by deforestation currently. And it just astounds me that why are we still deforesting? And in Australia, we're still deforesting. It's incredible. So there's a challenge there, and there's a challenge for agriculture. And I guess thinking about agriculture, what Susie described is the farmers that have innovated have been very good at retaining nutrients on their land. They've looked at working in an ecosystem context to be able to do that. So I see the Freshwater Alliance as being one that's much better integrated in a way, or enables the integration of agriculture, the economics, and of course the freshwater ecosystems. We can't pull them out. We have to put them together, and we have to talk pretty strongly.
So it's about advocacy too.
Yep.
Anybody else? Yes, over there.
Thank you. So when looking at your Venn diagram showing that one sweet spot between ecological, I think it was political and society, how all these three come together, what would you recommend? How can we actually make our studies hit that sweet spot?
Well, it's a bit late at the point of time that we're publishing, so you have to challenge whether the people that are funding us are asking us to adequately do that. Now, in the case of Susie's work in particular, in New Zealand, they're actually saying that you have to have shown a record before you're funded of working with the Indigenous people and not just acknowledging, not just consulting, but actually embedding them in the work the way that Lakes 380 is done. And so I'd say that that's what the funders are going to have to think about is not just we need to still do the best science, we need to drive that forward, but we have to be able to have an extension on it. And that is not just an extension, but it's actually a full integration. Yeah.
Thank you.
While I'm here, I wondered about, like, you mentioned at the end this need to predict into the future, and I'm wondering about this idea of sort of apathy that the society develops. So if we start getting models very accurate, it's kind of like the weather, right? If you know it's going to rain on Friday, you take your umbrella, you're a bit bothered about it, but if you don't know it's going to rain on Friday and suddenly starts raining, you're a bit shocked. You're like, okay, what do? I have to prepare. Maybe next time I react to this, I think more in advance that I don't know what's going to happen. Do we run into the problem with the predictive modeling of lakes where if we're telling everyone it's going to get worse, it gets worse, no one cares. Everyone said, oh, we knew it was going to get worse. We're not surprised. We don't have to do anything. And if we predict that it's going to get worse and it doesn't, we run into an even worse problem, right? We start to lose faith. So, like, where do you see the balance in terms of, like, having the models to be able to make decisions, but not having bad models, I guess?
I was thinking, just as you described that, the reactions to the climate models. Now, the early work, was very science-driven. How do we build these models of the global climate system or regional climate? Then we've put them out there, and I remember reading in EOS just the emails that politicians and others were throwing at these scientists to try and discredit the models. Well, I don't think anybody's discrediting them now, so that's where we need to. We're somewhere along that trajectory, but we don't have quite the we don't have quite the profile, of course, of the climate modelers. But that's what I'd say is, I went to many talks this morning. They're all showing a very consistent pattern right through. The climate is pervasive, and that we're on a certain trajectory. And I don't think we're, it's science-based. It's not going to be that we might get some things wrong, but generally, I think we're on the right path.
So our time is over, and we have a message to take home. Before we leave, I want to give our speakers a gift. But even before that, I just want to remind you that right after this is the session, the student competition session. So we have a 10-minute break, and we are back here to hear our students. And I'd like to, first, David, you're already on the podium. I'd like to give you this gift for giving us a fantastic lecture.
Thank you. Thanks for that.
It's Susie. Come up here. Another one for Susie. Thank you so much. We have a 10-minute break. No, one more. Yeah, sorry, I made a mistake. The student competition session comes afterwards. There's another session now. Excuse me. Look in the programs. Okay, see you later.